Welcome back, everybody. It's time for part 3 of Battle for Bikini Bottom, any percent world record explained. Yet again, lots of positive feedback on that last video, so thank you for all that, and I will do my very best to make this explanation even better than the last. So let's get started right where we left off. We have just exited the lighthouse with 10 spatulas and 6 wheels. As mentioned in the previous installment, 6 wheels is all we need to set up that aforementioned major exploit later in the run. You'll see what that is and how it works in due time, but for now, just know the important thing to take away is we are done collecting things in downtown. So as such, we are ready to leave this level and start collecting more spatulas in another world. The question therefore becomes, which world will that be? You'll notice at the top of the screen we have 10 spatulas already collected, which means we have just enough to unlock Goo Lagoon. However, we won't visit Goo Lagoon just yet. We're going to save that for later because it's actually faster to do it after the first boss fight. That'll make a lot more sense when you see how we complete that level. But the bottom line is, Goo Lagoon is off the table and the other 2 worlds accessible in this first area of the hub world have already been completed. So that leaves us with one more option for reaching the required number of 15 spatulas to fight the first boss, and that is sequence breaking the game to access the second and third hub world areas without having to complete the boss fights guarding them. And how might we do this? But of course, our old friend VMS. As a quick recap, vertical momentum storage allows us to transfer momentum created in one level to another by pausing on the exact frame of displacement and then jumping on the first frame you enter the next level. We used this strategy in the previous section of this series to skip a major portion of the downtown rooftops. But now that you're all graduated experts on VMS, I've decided to key you in on 2 extra details that I did not cram into the previous video. The first is that pausing one frame after releasing is actually done by pausing and releasing on the same frame. This sounds counterintuitive, but hear me out. When pausing this game, there is 1 frame of delay between the input and the game actually freezing, whereas pressing a button to release the SpongeBob happens on the exact frame you do it. So effectively, by pausing and releasing on the same frame, the game freeze is delayed until the next frame, where the displacement that we're trying to store actually occurs. So this allows us to calibrate the delay and pause the game on that frame of displacement for storing it into the next level. The second is that despite the jump out of the load being a frame perfect trick, this type of input is actually not specific to 1/60th of a second unlike the others. This is because the first frame loading into any level always lags longer than the intended duration of a frame, so the A press timing out of a VMS load is actually a lot more lenient than the typical 1 frame trick. However, the trick still requires a lot of skill and consistency, because the player must memorize the exact duration of all the loads leading into a VMS. Thankfully, the loads in this game are 100% consistent, but it can still get a bit jumbled and confusing trying to commit each of these load times to muscle memory. And I say each of these because there are other instances in this run, other than VMS, where we have to time a frame perfect input out of a load. You'll see another one of those later when we talk about the Murmur. But for now, let's get back to where we left off in the run and talk about this VMS setup for skipping to the second hub world. Immediately after leaving the lighthouse, we have to make a run for it to adhere to the floating cycle for these copper platforms over here. Collecting our 9th sock along the way, we're now going to drop down and set up another SpongeBob storage, which will be used to create SpongeBob displacement on top of the leftmost copper platform. Not only do these copper platforms float up and down, they also tilt back and forth, and the tilting along with the floating can also be used to create displacement. So to set this up perfectly, we need to understand that SpongeBob's first displacement location is going to set at the end of his transformation animation. That sounds like a lot of words, but all we're doing is starting the transformation earlier than you'd think, so that way at the end of the animation, SpongeBob forms his transformation position at the edge of the platform as it's tilting down, while the platform is also at the bottom of its floating cycle. Now the cool thing about this is that when SpongeBob's transformation location is on the edge of this platform, if we roll away from it, the platform still tilts back and forth as if we're still on it, just because his position is stored on top of the platform. So despite not physically being on the platform, we can roll away and the platform will tilt back up in the opposite direction, all while it's moving up on its floating cycle as well. So we store it on the edge of this platform while it's tilted all the way into the ground as the platform is at the bottom of its cycle, to then roll away and have the platform tilt up and go to the top of its cycle. So that's going to be a lot of displacement, and we're going to do the same thing we did earlier. Input the release and pause inputs on the same frame, so that way the release is immediate and the pause gets delayed for a frame to freeze the game immediately 1 frame after the release. Now we have effectively paused the game on the frame of displacement we created, so we can scroll all the way down to Patrick, which if you remember, that task was unlocked at the very beginning of the run when we collected the very first sock, just so we could do this VMS jump in a closer position to the second hub world, as opposed to doing it from all the way over by the pineapple. Of course, yet another way of how these small little routing decisions are making these big impacts later in the run. Now all we have to do is select the Patrick warp and time a frame perfect A press as soon as the level loads in, and this will send us flying straight into the air, giving us a more than generous amount of height to go over the invisible wall guarding the second hub world, and allowing us to land on top of the Shady Shoals rest home, which allows us access to potentially 3 more areas, skips a long cutscene and platforming challenge we'd usually have to do later, and awards us an extra golden spatula. We'll now jump off this building to get the final sock required for our first Patrick trade. Just as a reminder, if you visit Patrick in the first area of the hub world, you can trade 10 socks for 1 golden spatula. We'll bring that up again later, but for now just focus on the movement we do to get this sock. We're going to fall all the way down and attempt to drop slightly below this statue, to hit it with a bubble spin and jump over it all in one motion. Hitting this fountain statue awards us a sock. However, I did not execute the movement properly in this run. Here I'll show you a clip of what that looks like because I think it's really cool when it's done correctly. Now I hate to say it because we just got here, but we're now going to ditch the second area of the hub world and go straight to the third area, which will give us access to 3 more levels, one of which includes SpongeBob's Dream. And if you remember the ending of the previous video, that's where we gotta go next. To accomplish the skip to the third hub world, we're gonna have to set up some SpongeBob storage and carry it all the way over to this cliff next to the gate, which serves as the toll for the second boss fight we can't afford yet. So we have to be very careful not to get too close to this toll gate, otherwise the text box that tells us we don't have enough spatulas will pop up and cause us to lose control and make SpongeBob transform when he hits the ground. But if we're extremely careful, we can jump on the edge of this toll booth and up to the cliff, where we will set up an extremely precise and finicky transformation to roll up the cliff. Yes, this is as crazy as it looks. There is a lot of analog stick movement here, especially adjusting for the little bumps and curves in the wall itself. But ideally we want the perfect balance of holding into the wall so that way we don't bounce around too much, and also holding up the wall so that way we don't roll too slowly. And there is constant adjustment here to make sure that we're always sticking to the wall despite bouncing around so much. It is a crazy cool movement intensive trick which I feel gets overlooked a lot because it doesn't cause a lot of my own runs to reset. Once we strike this wall just right to get a big bounce off of it toward the chum bucket, we can press B to release the sponge ball, which allows us some grounded frames for using grounded moves, and use those frames to perform a single jump and then a double jump spin toward the chum bucket. Now we've uncovered yet another golden spatula and successfully skipped the first 2 major boss fights to get to the third hub world. However, as you know, we can't just go straight to the final boss from here. The final boss in the chum bucket lab requires 75 golden spatulas to enter, and the 2 major bosses that we just skipped over are going to be fought later to obtain power-ups that make the speedrun faster than it otherwise would be without them. So yes, we still have to get the 15 spatulas to fight Robo Sandy. So what we must do now is look for more spatulas in the only area within the third hub world that does not have a spatula requirement, which of course is SpongeBob's Dream. SpongeBob's Dream in Battle for Bikini Bottom is set up the exact same way it's set up in season 1 of the show. SpongeBob's own dream consists of himself visiting other people's dreams, and his own dream along with his friends' dreams are all playable levels in the video game. And you better pay close attention because even though SpongeBob is sleeping, things are about to get very fast paced. These spiky blocks at the start of the level turn and float on a cycle, and if we quickly platform to the edge of this block, walk off the side and jump as it's turning up, we can harness the momentum of that platform turning and perform a huge jump onto this next block earlier than intended. It is important to get up here as early as possible because we're trying to make a cycle later for the next skip we're about to do, and being slightly off that cycle will cost us time, but in extreme cases it'll kill the entire run. Because this is a speed run, we have all of these hits planned out and we're keeping an eye on our health, so if we jump on this exact spike on top of this block, we can draw a straight line from this floating block to the spike on top of the next block to the slide that we need to go to. And yes, I'd aim for this exact spike every time, because each of these spikes has an individual hitbox, and landing between them or on weird sides of them can cause you to go flying into random directions instead of straight up. And because there's no safe ground below SpongeBob's Dream, flying in random directions means death. And these spike hitbox properties absolutely apply to the next trick we're about to do. This next major skip we're about to do is called Super Bounce Skip, and it is used to cut straight to Squidward's Dream and the spatula awarded to us for reaching it without having to drop down, pay an expensive clam toll, watch a cutscene, and bounce all the way up to that part of the game. Getting onto this slide as quickly as possible to begin building momentum. We're going to accelerate all the way down this slide, and when we jump off the side of it, make sure our momentum vector is headed straight into this block, not to one side or the other. It needs to be straight into it. We need as much force as possible to head straight into this block, so that way SpongeBob gets caught on the edge of it. If SpongeBob isn't moving fast enough, he won't get caught. And if we do this the right way, his feet will get caught for just enough frames for us to be able to jump off the side of the block and onto the top of it. In a run where I got the proper cycle, I would have been able to jump from the side of this block all the way to the top of the trampoline instead of having to damage boost off the spikes and then onto the trampoline. For those of you who are curious to see what that looks like, here's a clip of it now. But in using this platforming exploit with slide momentum, we have successfully skipped a major shiny object toll and a very long cutscene. So now we can head straight to the spatula on top of Squidward's Dream. Now that we've collected the Super Bounce spatula, we can enter Squidward's Dream and then immediately leave. The reason being is that we need to save Squidward's Dream for a backtracking section later in the run, during which we will have access to an exploit which allows us to complete the level much faster than we'd be able to right now. And to longtime fans of this game, you already know what that is. But we've got a long way to go until we get there, so for now, let's go back to SpongeBob's Dream and get the rest of the spatulas in his dreamscape. Once again, upon loading into this level, we must work with the dream block cycle. The reason why we saved these spatulas for now instead of getting them immediately upon entering dream the first time is because the initial cutscene upon entering SpongeBob's dream pushes the block cycle just far back enough to make it far less lenient for doing this next trick. So now that we have a clean slate off of this load, we're going to run up to this block in an exact fashion to have his feet lined up with the edge of the block, like so. If we do a very light A press, and I mean so light this input sometimes even just drops and doesn't even go through, we can set up the most elegantly controlled spin you've ever seen to spin off this block and land precisely on the exact spike that is going to launch us up in the air, harnessing not just the damage boost off of this spike, but also the block momentum pushing us up. This trick is absolutely insane. We already talked earlier about how hitting any of these spikes in a spot other than the exact spot where we need to will just cause us to fly off in random directions. And this isn't just guiding SpongeBob to the tip of a spike in midair. This is spinning SpongeBob 270 degrees with an exact measurement of block friction to touch an exact face of one of the spikes on the edge of this block at an exact time, so we're being pushed up at max speed during the damage animation. And if we hit that just right to get just enough height, we can then, once again, react to one of the 5 different damage animations that plays when SpongeBob takes damage to perform a frame-perfect damage triple jump off the spike block momentum. And as long as our movement is tight enough and quick enough to not only reach the next platform, but also grab the spatula in the correct amount of time to continue on the cycle, we now enter the process of setting up yet another frame-perfect damage triple jump. We need to be very quick here after this spatula celebration ends, especially if we didn't get a high enough damage boost to cut a direct line straight to the spatula. The second part of this block cycle can potentially be very tight. We need to run up these blocks as quickly as possible and stay on the right edge of this center column as we approach the slick robot on the main platform. If we do this the right way, the slick AI will react to the way that we moved and start heading in the opposite direction. Assuming we did this quickly enough and correctly, we can hook a hard left and barely jump onto this next floating block right as it's turning onto its spiked side. And now for the grand finale. It's time to run off this cliff and use our coyote frames to get a grounded bash in midair. Much like the Thunder Tiki damage boost in downtown, we need to time this perfectly, otherwise the damage from the Slick's oil shield will cause us to get locked into our animation. If we time this the right way, SpongeBob will get knocked out of his bash animation and immediately transition into one of his 5 damage animations, which can then be reacted to for the player to time a frame-perfect triple jump once again out of the first frame that animation ends. This whole section not only allowing us to skip the entire bouncing ball following section, but also the entirety of SpongeBob's dream itself, and 2 more expensive toll gates along the way. As a side note, much like the double 1-frame segment in downtown that saves 5 to 6 seconds as an optimization, this frame-perfect damage boost off the Slick's oil shield actually has a 6 to 7 seconds slower alteration that the majority of players use in this area. So what I'm saying is, the addition of this frame-perfect jump here saves another 6 to 7 seconds off the run. That's a pretty great bargain to me, especially with the 2 in downtown saving 5 to 6 together. Now, I'll mention this here because it wasn't relevant to the 5 frame-perfect damage triple jumps we've done up until this point. But to somehow make things even more complicated, one of the 5 damage animations the player has to react to lasts for 2 extra frames compared to the other 4. This is why it's extremely important to pay attention to damage cycles at this level of play, because staying in your damage animation for 2 extra frames rather than not can not only impact the height of your hammer skip jump and how far you get sent down on the downtown cannon jump, but it can also impact how high you jump on the spike damage boost as well. And generally it's good to prime yourself for whether you're jumping 2 extra frames or not. This will not be the last time we see frame perfect damage triple jumps in this run, but these are definitely the most crucial. And I'm confident that after watching up to this point in the series, compounding all of the crazy precise tricks you witnessed so far and the movement bridging them together, you're going to be absolutely floored the next time you witness a live world record attempt reach this point of the run. So I'm going to ask you for 2 things. 1, leave a like on this video if you're impressed by the amount of skill displayed in just the first 10 minutes of this run. And 2, check out my Twitch channel where I attempt to beat the world record live every single day. Twitch.tv/shift. Stop in whenever you'd like. At this point of the run, we have collected 15 spatulas. However, we still have to wrap up the dream area by backtracking in the reverse order to Patrick's dream and collecting a spatula from him. And even after this, we are still not ready to fight Robo Sandy, because now it's time for the big payoff on why we avoided Mr. Krabs in the beginning of the game and collected all of these shiny objects. We're going to pause the game after collecting the spatula from Patrick's dream and warp all the way up to the Chum Bucket spatula, which we've already unlocked by skipping to the 3rd hub world early and collecting the spatula on top of the Chum Bucket. This will place us right between the Chum Bucket and the Krusty Krab. And despite Mr. Krabs not being outside the Krusty Krab because he's still positioned in the first area of the hub world, due to us not even having progressed the game state to the 2nd hub world yet, we can still get Mr. Krabs to teleport over to us and give us the Krusty Krab mission just by walking into his dialogue trigger trigger that is intended to be used after defeating the second boss fight. And if you look closely at this exact frame, you can see the point where he blips into existence. And this text box unlocks the infestation at the Krusty Krab mission, so we can pause the game and warp to it now. This saves a tiny bit of time as opposed to walking up to the Krusty Krab doors and entering from there. Now we need to pay very close attention to the number in the upper right corner of the screen. That 2,526 is not looking very good. So the rest of this combat section is gonna be tight to make that 3,000 shiny objects I mentioned needed to be obtained before we leave the Krusty Krab. With a slight maneuver, much like on the downtown rooftops, we can get this Chuck to fire a missile away from us and then strike him with a bubble spin. Quickly turning and igniting this Thunder Tiki and running away from it will essentially create a bomb that will rise up when we walk away from it due to these Shush Tikis from under it which contracted when we got near, expanding once again as we walk away. Now this Thunder Tiki bomb is going to rise up to the next level of the Krusty Krab and blow up the Sleepy Time robot on the upper left section of the restaurant. Now we can manipulate the Chuck that is out of view currently to fire a missile at the ground next to me, as opposed to firing at the condiment island that we're going to use to get up to the next level. If we're just quick enough, we can jump from the condiment island to the upper section of the Krusty Krab and hit the Sleepy Time robot with a well-timed and positioned bubble spin right before his spotlight attack can get us. And keep in mind, if you get hit by that spotlight attack once, he will just continuously hit you over and over again, so it is game over if you get hit by that. So thankfully we did not, and now we can make our way over this support beam to destroy the Duplicatotron responsible for producing the robots on the ground floor. Now this next part has a subtle detail that many will miss. I am purposefully going to attack the Thunder Tiki for 3 reasons. The first is that it's inadvertently going to destroy the Chuck robot because in this situation it was close enough to be hit by the explosion. The second reason is that taking damage causes these smaller robots on the bottom floor to taunt after they notice you've been hurt. The reason why this is important is that while the robots are celebrating you taking the hit, they will stop moving and scattering around the restaurant floor trying to attack you. So taking this damage while destroying the Chuck also causes these pesky robots on the ground floor to stay in place. And thankfully, because I got good enough spawns and AI movement, I can combo 3 of these robots on the ground floor with the Tiki and the Chuck that I destroyed on the top, which is thereby the third benefit. At this point, there's only 1 more robot left on the floor, and that nice big combo gave me enough shiny objects to barely meet the 3,000 requirement, with just a tiny bit of waiting after. Ideally, you want to have more than enough shiny objects so that way when the final robot dies, you can immediately pause the game with 3,000 and warp back to Bikini Bottom. But in some less fortunate situations, you're going to have to wait a couple of seconds for not only the combo to end, but also for the shiny objects from the combo to attract to you. Fortunately, in this case, despite being so tight on shiny objects, we did not have to wait very long. So now we can warp back to any area of the main hub world and Mr. Krabs will teleport us back to where he's supposed to be. And this is where we'll initiate the payoff. So we've already discussed how trading 10 socks to Patrick awards you a golden spatula. And there are 8 separate missions just like this where you trade 10 socks to Patrick, totaling to 8 spatulas for 80 socks. In the any % speedrun, we only get 2 spatulas from Patrick for trading 20 socks. But unlike Patrick's missions where we'll only be completing 2 of 8, for Mr. Krabs' missions, we're going to be completing 9 of 8. And no, that was not misspeak. For the right price and accessible from the beginning of the game, Mr. Krabs will sell you golden spatulas for shiny objects. In the next part of this series, we're going to talk about an exploit that generates so many shiny objects that we can instantly buy all 8 of Mr. Krabs' shiny object spatulas. But with extremely specific maneuvers and conditions in the first section of the run, we can actually purchase the first shiny object challenge from Mr. Krabs and then purchase it again later with the bulk of the spatulas we're going to buy with the exploit. Hence, buying the same spatula twice and then buying the rest of the 7 gives us the 9 out of 8. But it needs to be done in an exact, specific way, otherwise it will not work at all. So here's what we have to do. Upon starting a new game, the first time the player talks to Mr. Krabs in the hub world, they will receive dialogue explaining how Mr. Krabs will trade spatulas for shiny objects, which immediately leads to another prompt that asks the player if they'd like to purchase one if they have enough. Because we avoided talking to Mr. Krabs at the beginning of the run, and due to us not being able to receive the shiny object challenge the first time we talked to him, being that he's distressed due to the robots taking over the Krusty Krab, the first time we can possibly receive the prompt for his shiny object trading missions occurs outside the Krusty Krab after we've cleared out all the robots. So now we've sequence broken the entire game to purchase the first spatula for 3,000 shiny objects before we've even unlocked the first task for Mr. Krabs. You'll see this working as we warp back to the first area of the hub world and talk to Mr. Krabs in his intended spot to find that he's giving us the same initial speech for his shiny object challenge yet again. So we have effectively purchased the first 3,000 shiny object spatula from Hub Area 3 Krabs and then activated the non-sequence broken task list from Hub Area 1 Krabs. An easy way of thinking about this is that we purchased the first spatula from an imposter, and after the spatula is sealed away, we can talk to Mr. Krabs in the first hub area as intended to activate the true non-sequence broken task from Mr. Krabs, which by design will be transferred transfer to the second hub area of Mr. Krabs after the game state changes from defeating the first major boss. This is the reason why we complete all of these objectives in this exact order. Mr. Krabs must be avoided at the start of the game, so that way when we encounter him outside of the Krusty Krab, we can purchase the imposter spatula, then activate the true set of spatulas at the beginning of the game, and naturally progress those spatulas into the next part of the game, for which all 8 of the intentional spatulas will be purchased later in the run. In addition to the unintended spatula, this gives us a total of 9. And as a little added bonus for optimization, remember that clearing out the Krusty Krab awards us a spatula as well. So when we purchase this unintended spatula, we can jump over the spatula for clearing out the Krusty Krab and purchase the duplicate spatula at the same time we collect the other one, thus allowing us to pause the game and warp away after only watching one of the 2 spatula animations intended. And you'll see a visual bug here as well. When we pause the game to warp back to the first area of the hub world, you'll only see a count of 17 spatulas reflecting the one that we just got from clearing out the Krusty Krab. But as soon as we load back into the hub world, you'll notice that number has already updated to 18. And as mentioned before, we will now activate the true set of missions from Mr. Krabs as we're making our way over to Squidward's house. You'll be pretty relieved to hear this part isn't going to melt your brain like the last one. All we have to do is jump enough times to annoy Squidward to the point of bribing us to leave his house. And the exact number to initiate the bribery is 10. But the game doesn't literally count 10 jumps. It is only concerned with how many times you've risen above a vertical point in the level. So if I use my grounded jump to go above this trigger and then let myself fall below it again, I can use my double jump to go above it again without having to wait all the time it would take to land on the ground and do a single jump again. So this will effectively be a well-timed pattern of jump, double jump, jump, double jump. And if we alternate between these two 5 times, that gives us the required number of 10 to get the spatula. And at last, we are finally ready to pause the game, scroll down and warp to Patrick yet again, and get off our first trade of 10 socks for 1 spatula. It is crucial that we trade for a spatula at this point in the game, not because we need enough to enter the Poseidon, because clearly we already have enough. The reason why this saves time is because we'd otherwise have to rewarp here later to trade for this spatula, whereas if we trade it right now, we are utilizing the necessity to warp here to walk to the Poseidon anyway. You might also be wondering why we're entering the Poseidon, home of the first major boss fight, with 20 spatulas instead of 15. Can this possibly be optimized? And if you really think about it, for our current knowledge of the game, yes it is. Because not only due to optimizing where and when we warp along with how many times we load these levels, we are also very much tied down to the specific procedure required to get the extra Mr. Krabs spatula at the beginning of the game. Because remember, if we do not do this exact procedure before the game state changes from defeating the first boss, this will not work. And getting an entire extra spatula just from optimizing how many shiny objects we get along the way in the first 10 minutes of this run is extremely optimized. And not only is it incredibly valuable to essentially create a spatula out of thin air, the time that we get it in the run is also crucial as well. Because having extra spatulas like this in the beginning of the run impact which things we can do later, and therefore even faster due to our increased kit of exploits available later in the game. I know a lot of this is sounding vague and confusing, especially if you're not familiar with this run yet, but I at least want you all to understand that the complexity of these routing decisions rivals the insanity of the tricks you have witnessed so far in this run. So in other words, if you thought you've seen crazy so far, you ain't seen nothing yet. Alright, we got the first major boss here, Robo Sandy, and the name of the game is AI manipulation, but unlike the other robots in the game, her behavior is 100% consistent. In this first phase of the fight, it is crucial to keep her in center stage, because approaching her after her first attack causes her to pounce early, which is necessary for exposing her weak spot to progress the fight. Exposing Robo Sandy's weak spot 3 times and bubble bouncing on the ground causes the fight to progress to the next phase. Now in this phase, there's no manipulation to make her attack quicker, and she's also going to mix in another attack called the clothesline move. Robo Sandy's clothesline move is activated when she walks into the invisible triggers on the corners of the stage. So if we can carefully lure her up to the exact edge of these triggers, so that way she's just barely outside of them, we can minimize the amount of time it takes for her to run to the edge of the stage and start attacking. As an added bonus, the hitbox for the clothesline move does not extend to the walls of the stage. So instead of having to dodge her spring attacks, we can just stand on the edge of the stage and not get hit. Now I'm going to stand in this exact spot of the stage, so when she's finished attacking, she'll pounce on me and land in that exact spot. And by slamming in an exact spot following this, I can use the heavy lifting character Patrick to pick up the robot's head and throw it into the fallen scoreboard. This delivers a shock that knocks off another slice of Robo Sandy's health. Now we can double back and lure her back into the clothesline move trigger to repeat this process twice more and initiate the final phase. Similarly, in the final phase, Sandy will still use the clothesline move against us, but this time she's going to attack us with 2 spring attacks instead of just 1. And we can just stand on the edge of the stage and avoid all of it. But the manipulation is going to be pretty similar to how we did it with Patrick as well, except we're going to stand in a slightly different spot, since this time we don't need to accommodate an exact spot for her head to fly off and throw into the scoreboard. This time her head just pops off and we have to bash it. And deceivingly, the hitbox for the head doesn't even come out until a little bit after the head pops off. So you'll see that I wait for a tiny bit after the head comes off to initiate the bash. This is intentional. And once again, we must repeat this process 2 more times to finish the final phase and therefore the first major boss fight. The elephant in the room is that this spatula takes way longer to complete than the other 20 that we just finished at lightning speed. So you might be wondering why we even go out of our way to fight this boss, especially when we were able to skip over it. And furthermore, that there's a possible way to collect the spatula for this fight early by clipping under the stage and collecting it from there. But neither of these options are fast in the grand scheme of the full run, and the reason why is because of the bubble bowl. The bubble bowl is the single most important game mechanic in SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom. Because the cutscene at the end of the fight awards the bubble bowl and the spatula, while collecting the spatula from under the stage only awards the spatula itself, we need to finish the whole boss fight, otherwise it's just another spatula. The bubble bowl is absolutely necessary, and if going out of our way to collect a spatula that is 6 times slower than the others we've seen in the run so far isn't enough to demonstrate how important this is, you will surely be able to see for yourself in the next part of this series when we completely annihilate Goo Lagoon. Subscribe for more and enable notifications.